Today, we're going to talk about a name that's practically become a legend, a name that's synonymous with a level of wealth that is so huge it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Mansa Musa.
So let's just start with a big question. When you think of the wealthiest person who ever lived, who pops into your head? Maybe a modern tech billionaire, an oil baron, one of those Gilded Age industrialists?
Well, get ready, because the real answer is probably going to surprise you. History points to someone not from our era, but to a 14th century African king whose fortune was so massive, people who've tried to calculate it just call it incalculable.
So let's meet him. We are talking about Mansa Musa, the ninth ruler or Mansa of the Mali Empire. His story is just incredible. It's about power, faith, and just a staggering amount of gold.
All right, so let's just tackle that giant claim right up front. Was he really the richest person in history? Well, to even start to unpack that, we first need to understand what his title actually means.
So the word Mansa, it's not his first name. It literally means ruler or king in the Mande language. It was the title for the big boss, the sovereign of one of the most powerful empires on the planet at the time. And Mansa Musa was its most famous king, for sure.
And that empire, that was the source of his unbelievable wealth. You really can't talk about Musa's fortune without talking about the golden empire he was in charge of.
Musa was on the throne for about 25 years. And you have to understand, this period is widely seen as the absolute peak, the golden age of Mali's power and influence. A full quarter-century running a massive, booming empire.
And when I say massive, I am not kidding. At its height under Musa, the Mali Empire was just sprawling. It controlled over 400 cities and stretched across what we now know as Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, and even further.
So where did all this money come from? It wasn't just one thing, it was like a perfectly designed wealth-generating machine. First, they had unbelievable amounts of gold. They probably controlled about half the world's entire supply at the time. Then, they taxed the super valuable salt trade that crossed the Sahara. They also dominated all the key trade routes, and on top of that, they collected tribute from all the smaller states they controlled. It was the whole shebang.
Now, all this insane wealth allowed Musa to do something that would cement his name in history forever. His Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, back in 1324. And let me tell you, this was no ordinary road trip.
The numbers here are just mind-boggling. I mean, just try to picture it. His caravan was enormous, including thousands of enslaved people, all dressed in the finest silks, with each one of them carrying a 4-pound solid gold bar. And then, the camels, 80 of them, each loaded with hundreds of pounds of pure gold dust. The man was basically a moving city made of gold.
The journey itself was an absolute epic, covering more than 2,700 miles. He left Mali, made this jaw-dropping 3-month stop in Cairo, where he spent lavishly, completed his holy pilgrimage in Mecca, and then he headed home. But he didn't just bring back souvenirs. He brought back the intellectual firepower of the entire Muslim world.
Seriously, the world had never seen anything like it. The historian Shihab al-Umari, who visited Cairo years later, said people were still talking about it. He called it what it was, a lavish display of power and wealth on a scale that was totally unprecedented. This was Musa putting his empire and himself on the world map.
And that grand statement had wildly different effects in different places. The ripples from his journey were felt from the bustling markets of Cairo all the way to the legendary city of Timbuktu. Okay, get this. In Cairo, Musa gave away so much gold to the poor, on gifts, you name it, that he single-handedly crashed the entire regional economy. The value of gold just tanked, and from what we know, it didn't recover for more than 10 years. Just think about that. One guy had so much personal wealth, he could devalue a precious metal across the Mediterranean. This event was so shocking, it's actually what put Mali on European maps. A few decades later, he appears on the famous Catalan Atlas, literally holding a giant gold nugget.
But here is where the story takes this amazing turn. Because while his spending caused an economic crisis in Cairo, that very same wealth, when he brought it back home, was about to kick off an incredible cultural renaissance. He basically turned his gold into knowledge.
On his way back, he recruited architects and scholars from across the Muslim world. He started this huge building program back home, creating legendary structures like the great Jinga Weber Mosque in Timbuktu, which, by the way, is still standing today.
He poured his resources into institutions like the University of Sankore. He brought in all these brilliant minds he'd met on his travels, and the university just exploded.
It became this magnet for jurists, astronomers, and mathematicians from all over Africa and the Middle East. He was investing in brainpower.
But, like with any larger-than-life historical figure, his legacy, well, it's complicated. How people remember him really depends on who you're asking.
And this part is so fascinating. On the one hand, you have Arab writers like the famous Ibn Khaldun, who just praised him as this great, pious, and generous king. But back in his own homeland, the oral traditions, the stories passed down by the court storytellers, the Jeliw, they tell a different story. Some of them paint him as being unfaithful to tradition, accusing him of basically wasting the empire's wealth on his foreign travels.
Which, of course, brings us right back to our very first question. After looking at all of this, what's the verdict? Was Mansa Musa the richest person who ever lived?
Well, the modern consensus is that trying to put an exact number on his wealth today is basically impossible. The records aren't all there, and comparing wealth across centuries and different economies just doesn't work. But really, that kind of misses the point. The legend of his wealth has lasted for a reason. It reflects a simple truth. He had so much money, it was simply inconceivable to the people of his time, and honestly, it's still pretty inconceivable to us today.
So I'll just leave you with this to think about. The stories of his gold are what made him famous, no doubt. But his investments in learning, in culture, in architecture, those have also lasted for centuries. So what's the truer measure of a legacy? The gold you spend or the knowledge you build?